My name is Sasha. I am 34 years old and somehow still healing from the deep wounds my own family inflicted on me. As a successful corporate executive, I built my own empire to escape their toxicity, but I still tried to maintain a sliver of connection. Last Christmas, they invited me to the annual family dinner. I stood on the snowy front porch, holding a beautiful red velvet gift box. My father opened the door, looked me up and down, and smirked. He told me I was ruining the mood and banned me from stepping inside my own childhood home. I simply smiled, handed my mother the gift, and turned to walk away forever. But then my sister's wealthy new boyfriend stepped out of the kitchen, and the look of absolute terror on his face changed my family dynamic permanently. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your true worth. Growing up in the south suburbs of Chicago meant you understood the immense value of keeping up appearances. Our large brick colonial home with its pristine white trim and perfectly shoveled driveway looked like a fortress of warmth and holiday cheer to the outside world. But inside those thick walls, emotional coldness permeated every single corner of our lives. For years, I was the designated family scapegoat. I was the one who could never do anything right, while my older sister Monique was the undisputed golden child. Tonight was supposed to be a peaceful truce. It was Christmas Eve, and the winter air was freezing, biting fiercely at my cheeks as I walked up the long concrete driveway. I wore my tailored wool coat and carried a small red velvet box tight in my hands. Inside that box was a profound gesture of goodwill. It was a peace offering that cost more than both of their cars combined. As I reached the front steps, I could hear the faint, joyful sound of classic holiday music playing from the living room stereo. I could smell the rich, savory scent of baked macaroni and cheese, savory collard greens, and roasted turkey wafting through the tiny cracks of the heavy wooden front door. I took a deep breath, letting the icy Chicago air fill my lungs and calm my racing heart. I told myself this year would finally be different. I was a grown woman now. I was the chief executive officer of a massive private equity firm, though my family had absolutely no idea about my wealth. They still thought I was the same struggling, confused girl who had to beg them for financial help years ago. I rang the brass doorbell. The familiar chime echoed loudly inside the house. Laughter spilled out from the main hallway. I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the entryway. The front door swung open, revealing my father, Calvin. He stood there in his crisp, burgundy holiday sweater, looking down at me with the exact same expression he used when I tracked mud into the house as a little girl. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. He did not step aside to let me out of the freezing cold night. Instead, he placed his large hand firmly on the doorframe, physically blocking my entry into the house. Behind his broad shoulders, I could see the warm, inviting glow of the living room fireplace. I could see my mother Brenda hovering nervously near the hallway table, holding a silver tray of appetizers. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and bright. I held up the red velvet box toward him. "I brought something special for you and Mom tonight." Calvin did not smile. He did not even look at the gift. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut right through the festive holiday music playing softly behind him. "Let us not make this about you tonight, Sasha," he sneered. His voice was low but filled with unmistakable venom. "You always ruin Monique's vibe. She is in a fantastic mood right now. She brought her new boyfriend over to meet the family for the first time, and we absolutely do not need your negative energy dragging everyone down. Just leave the gift on the porch and go home." I stood there in stunned silence as the winter snow began to fall much heavier, landing softly on my dark hair and my wool shoulders. I looked past my father at my mother. Brenda quickly averted her eyes, looking straight down at the marble floor tiles. She would never, ever stand up to him. She would always protect Monique's fragile peace over my basic existence. That was the firmly established rule of this household. I was fully expected to beg or argue or cry on the porch. In the past, I definitely would have. I would have demanded to know why I was being treated like an unwanted stray dog on Christmas Eve. I would have let them see me break. But I was no longer that broken little girl. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of the emotional hurt that my father so desperately wanted to see. Instead, I smiled. A genuine, calm, confident smile that immediately seemed to confuse him. I reached out and gently pressed the red velvet box into my mother's trembling hands. "Merry Christmas, Mom," I said softly and genuinely. "Enjoy your evening." I turned around gracefully, my leather heels clicking softly against the ice-covered porch. I was fully prepared to walk back to my waiting black luxury sedan and never look back at this house again. I was ready to leave them to their toxic delusions forever. But the universe had a completely different plan for us that cold night. Just as my gloved hand reached the freezing metal of the stair railing, the heavy wooden door to the kitchen swung wide open. A tall white man with sandy blonde hair stepped into the brightly lit hallway, holding a crystal glass of red wine. He was laughing loudly at a joke Monique had just told him. Then his eyes drifted toward the open front door. He saw me standing on the snowy porch. The laughter died in his throat instantly. Before Connor could even process what he was seeing, my Aunt Yvonne's shrill voice pierced through the open kitchen door. She was sitting comfortably in the living room, completely unaware that I could hear every single word she was saying. I could picture her perfectly sitting on my mother's expensive leather sofa, holding a plate of appetizers and looking down her nose at the world. "She still has that same arrogant attitude," Yvonne announced loudly over the holiday music. "Did you see the way she just stood there looking at Calvin? No wonder she cannot keep a man to save her life. Who wants to deal with a woman who always thinks she is smarter than everyone else in the room?" My Uncle Terence chimed in immediately, his deep voice echoing off the hallway walls. He was always Yvonne's faithful echo chamber, agreeing with whatever mean-spirited thought she produced. "You are right about that, Yvonne. That girl always had a massive chip on her shoulder. She thinks she is too good for her own blood. Calvin is exactly right to keep her outside tonight. If you let her in, she would just sit at the dinner table judging everyone and bringing the whole mood down with her endless negativity." I stood on the porch feeling the cold winter wind whipping around my legs and locked eyes with Connor. He looked like he had just seen a ghost materialize on the front steps. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly styled, and he wore a very expensive tailored suit that I instantly recognized, but his face had drained of all human color. He was completely paralyzed in the doorway holding his glass of red wine. He could not move forward and he could not step back. He just kept staring at me, his brain desperately trying to calculate why his terrifying corporate boss, the woman who controlled his entire professional future, was standing on his girlfriend's front porch in the freezing snow, being insulted by her family. Inside the warm house, the gossip continued to flow as freely as the alcohol. "I am just glad I never gave her a single dime when she came begging to me years ago," Yvonne continued, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction and pride. "Do you remember that Terrence? She had the absolute nerve to ask me for $5,000 to start some ridiculous real estate business. $5,000 I told her to get a real job like a normal person instead of daydreaming about buying commercial buildings. She was so ungrateful and disrespectful when I said no." I remembered that specific day perfectly. I had meticulously drafted a 40-page business plan. I had analyzed the commercial real estate market in downtown Chicago and found a perfectly undervalued property that was ripe for acquisition. I just needed a small bridge loan to cover the final closing costs. Yvonne had laughed right in my face and called my ambitions delusional. What she conveniently forgot to mention to her captive living room audience tonight was what she did the very next week. She had happily written a personal check for $8,000 to Monique, so my sister could buy a limited edition designer handbag to impress a guy she was dating at the time. That was the established family dynamic. Funding my sister's vanity and superficial lifestyle was considered a solid investment, but funding my education and my legitimate business ventures was considered a total waste of money. At that exact moment, Monique stepped into the hallway. I could not see her yet, but I could hear her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. "Oh, Auntie Vaughn, please stop talking about her," Monique said, her voice dripping with fake exhaustion. "You are going to ruin my appetite before we even cut the turkey." Monique stepped into my line of sight, coming up right behind Connor. She was wearing a completely inappropriate emerald green silk dress that looked like it belonged at a summer cocktail party rather than a family Christmas dinner. She had a smug, satisfied smile plastered across her meticulously contoured face. She wrapped her arms around Connor from behind, pressing her cheek against his broad back. "Let us talk about happy things tonight," Monique purred loud enough for the whole house to hear. "Let us talk about my amazing man standing right here. Did I tell you guys he just got promoted to Director of Risk Management at his firm? He is making more money than anyone in this entire neighborhood combined. We are already looking at buying a house in the north suburbs together, one of the really expensive ones with a gate." Yvonne gasped in exaggerated delight, clapping her hands together. "Oh, praise the Lord. Finally a man who can take proper care of you, Monique. You deserve the absolute best things in life. You have always been the most beautiful and sweetest girl in this entire family." Monique giggled, soaking up the praise like a sponge. "Thank you, Auntie Vaughn. Connor is just so incredibly successful, and he treats me like an absolute queen, not like the pathetic losers my sister used to bring around. Honestly, I feel bad for Sasha sometimes. It must be so miserable being her. Always struggling financially, always angry at the world." I stood perfectly still on the icy porch. The snow was gathering heavily on the dark shoulders of my coat. I did not break eye contact with Connor for a single second. He was still staring directly at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning realization. He was listening to the woman he supposedly loved proudly trash-talk her own sister. He was listening to her brag arrogantly about his salary, his promotion, and his prestigious job title. But what Monique did not know, what my father, my aunt, and my mother did not know, was that I was the one who signed Connor's massive paychecks. I was the chief executive officer and sole founder of the private equity firm that had just hired him away from his previous job. I was the one who personally approved his recent lucrative promotion. I owned the entire company he bragged about. Connor's breathing became visibly shallow and erratic. His chest rose and fell in quick, panicked jerks. His eyes darted nervously from my calm face to the red velvet box still resting in my mother's hands and then rapidly back to my face. He felt Monique's arms wrapped tightly around his waist, and he looked completely suffocated by her touch. The confident, successful man who had walked out of the kitchen a minute ago was completely gone. He was replaced by a terrified mid-level employee who had just realized he walked blindly into a career-ending nightmare. Monique, completely oblivious to the massive tension radiating off her boyfriend, squeezed him tighter. "Honey, why are you just standing there in the cold draft?" she asked playfully, her tone sickly sweet. "Shut the door so we can go back to the party and drink our wine." Connor opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His jaw worked silently, his right hand began to tremble violently. The heavy crystal glass of red wine tilted dangerously in his grip. The dark red liquid sloshed against the delicate edges of the rim. He tried to tighten his fingers around the stem to regain control, but his motor skills completely failed him under the crushing weight of his panic. The glass slipped from his trembling fingers entirely. The sound of the shattering crystal glass was deafening in the sudden quiet of the hallway. The cheerful holiday music playing from the living room stereo suddenly felt entirely out of place. A massive wave of dark red wine splashed aggressively across the polished wood floor, sending a spray of dark droplets right onto the delicate hem of Monique's expensive emerald green silk dress. Monique let out a piercing, dramatic shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. She immediately began complaining loudly about how much the designer dress cost and how Connor was being so incredibly clumsy. She stood there with her hands on her hips, fully expecting him to drop to his knees and apologize to her profusely. She expected him to gently dab at her ruined silk fabric with club soda and beg for her forgiveness, while our parents rushed over to comfort her. That was how the world worked in Monique's mind. She was the absolute center of the universe, and everyone else existed simply to serve her immediate needs. But Connor did not even look at her. He completely ignored the woman he was supposedly planning to buy a gated house with. His panicked, wide eyes remained locked entirely on me. He saw that a few tiny drops of the red wine had splashed onto the toes of my black leather heels. Connor moved faster than I had ever seen him move in our corporate office. He shoved past a stunned Monique, almost knocking her off balance. He scrambled toward the nearby dining table and grabbed a handful of white cloth napkins. Then he threw himself onto the cold, wet hardwood floor right at my feet. The sharp shards of broken crystal crunched audibly beneath his knees, but he did not seem to care or even notice the pain. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He began frantically wiping the tiny drops of wine off my shoes, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely hold the napkins. The entire house fell into a stunned, breathless silence. My father Calvin stood firmly in the doorway, his mouth hanging slightly open in pure shock. His large hands fell limply to his sides. My mother Brenda froze completely with the silver tray of appetizers shaking so hard in her hands that the stuffed mushrooms began to slide off the edge. In the living room, Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence had abruptly stopped their malicious gossiping. They were now craning their necks from the leather couch, their eyes bulging out of their heads as they tried to comprehend the bizarre scene unfolding in the entryway. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. For my entire life, my parents had treated me like the dirt beneath their shoes. They had actively banned me from the house on holidays, they had constantly mocked my ambitions, and they only ever tolerated my presence when it suited their narrative of being a generous Christian family. I was the family scapegoat, the child they were all deeply ashamed of. Yet here was a highly educated, wealthy white man, a powerful director of risk management, who made hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, kneeling in spilled wine and broken glass, physically scrubbing the shoes of the woman they all despised. It was a complete inversion of everything they believed to be true about the world. Here was a man my parents desperately wanted to impress, a man they saw as my sister's ultimate prize, bowing at my feet like a terrified subordinate. He knew exactly who I was. At Apex Holdings, I was not the quiet younger sister who took verbal abuse from her family. I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of a private equity firm that managed hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial real estate assets. Connor had only been at my company for 3 months, but he had already witnessed me dismantle entire corporate boards and fire a senior vice president without batting a single eyelash. He knew my reputation for being completely ruthless and demanding absolute excellence. And now he had just shattered a glass of red wine at my feet, while his girlfriend's family openly humiliated me. In his mind, his lucrative career was already over. "Ms. Washington, I am so incredibly sorry," Connor stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably as he kept his head bowed. "Please forgive me. I did not see you standing there. I am so sorry about your shoes. I will pay to replace them immediately. Please let me clean this up, boss." The word boss hung heavily in the tense air of the hallway like a physical object. It echoed in the total silence. Calvin blinked rapidly, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He looked from the kneeling, trembling man in the expensive tailored suit to my calm, unbothered face. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently and so suddenly that none of them could process the reality of what they were witnessing. My mother let out a small, confused gasp. I did not step back. I did not tell Connor to get up. I simply looked down at him, allowing the heavy silence to stretch out for a few more agonizing seconds. It was a calculated corporate move to establish absolute dominance in a room full of people who had just spent the last 20 minutes tearing down my character. Monique stared down at her boyfriend, her perfectly contoured face twisting into an ugly mix of anger and sheer bewilderment. She looked at the dark red stain ruining her expensive silk dress, and then looked down at Connor, who was still desperately wiping my black leather shoes. Her brain simply refused to accept the information playing out right in front of her eyes. She let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded harsh and brittle in the quiet house. She reached down and grabbed Connor by the shoulder of his suit jacket, trying to forcefully pull him up from the wet floor. "You are confused, babe," Monique said dismissively, waving her manicured hand in the air as if she could simply brush away the reality of the situation. "Get up from the floor right now. You are embarrassing yourself in front of my parents. That is not your boss. That is just my useless, younger sister." Connor slowly pushed himself up from the wet hardwood floor, his expensive suit pants completely ruined by the dark red wine and the tiny shards of broken crystal. He did not look at Monique with the same loving admiration and blind affection he had shown her just 10 minutes ago in the kitchen. Instead, he looked at her like she was completely out of her mind. He straightened his posture, brushing the dirt from his knees, and his entire demeanor shifted right before our eyes. He transformed from a terrified subordinate caught in a massive corporate blunder into a rational man who had just realized he was dating a pathological liar. "Do not ever speak about her like that again," Connor said, his voice dropping into a hard, authoritative tone that made Monique physically recoil in shock. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about." Monique let out a loud, offended gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to rest against her chest. She looked at my parents, fully expecting my father to immediately jump to her defense and reprimand Connor for daring to raise his voice at her in their family home. But Calvin remained completely silent, his eyes darting nervously between Connor and me. Connor reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. His fingers were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline as he unlocked the screen and opened his web browser. The hallway was dead silent, except for the faint sound of holiday music from the living room and the sound of his thumb rapidly tapping against the glass screen. He navigated to a specific web page, waiting a brief second for the high-resolution images to load, and then he aggressively shoved the phone right into Monique's face. "Read it," Connor demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings of the entryway. "Read exactly what it says on the screen right now, Monique." Monique blinked rapidly, her heavy fake eyelashes fluttering as she tried to focus on the glowing rectangular screen. She let out a confused and dismissive breath. "It is just some stupid, boring business article," she muttered, trying to physically push his hand away from her face. "It is the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for the city of Chicago," Connor corrected her, his tone incredibly sharp and completely devoid of any previous warmth. "Look at the featured photograph right at the top of the page. Look at the name printed in bold letters right underneath it." My mother, Brenda, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the small digital text from a distance. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence had completely abandoned the living room by now and were creeping into the hallway to get a better look at the drama unfolding. "That is Sasha," Monique whispered, her voice suddenly sounding very small and completely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. She stared at the professional photograph of me, wearing a tailored gray power suit, standing in a sleek, modern office. "Why is her picture on this prestigious website? This has to be some kind of sick joke or a scam she paid for." Connor let out a bitter laugh that sounded almost entirely hollow. He pulled the phone back and quickly navigated away from the web browser to a different secure application. He opened the private corporate web portal for Apex Holdings. He rapidly typed in his employee credentials, clicked on the executive leadership directory, and turned the screen around so the entire family could see it clearly. My professional headshot was displayed prominently at the very top of the massive organizational chart. Right below my name in crisp, clear letters was my official corporate title, Chief Executive Officer and Founder. "She is not a useless younger sister," Connor said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty and deeply ingrained respect. "Sasha Washington is the sole founder of a private equity firm that controls hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial real estate assets across the entire Midwest. She is the brilliant woman who personally approved my executive hiring last month. She signs my massive paychecks, Monique. She sits at the absolute top of the corporate food chain while you are out here playing pretend. The heavy silence that followed his words was so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the entire house. Uncle Terence let out a low, extended whistle of pure disbelief. Aunt Yvonne covered her mouth with both of her hands, her eyes wide with absolute, utter shock. The niece she had just mocked mercilessly for being poor and single was actually a self-made multimillionaire who possessed more wealth than their entire extended family combined. But Connor was not finished tearing down the illusions. He looked directly into Monique's eyes and delivered the final crushing blow to her fragile, fabricated reality. "And do you want to know the absolute best part of all of this?" Connor asked, his voice dripping with a newfound profound disgust. "Last week I was reviewing the risk assessment files for our latest major corporate acquisition. Apex Holdings just finalized the massive purchase of the commercial retail plaza on the west side of the city. The exact same building where you rent that overpriced tiny retail space for your little day spa." Monique physically stumbled backward, as if she had just been struck violently in the chest by an invisible force. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no words came out. "That is right," Connor continued, relentlessly refusing to give her a single inch of mercy. "The exact same spa that you have been constantly complaining about for months. The struggling business you told me is barely making enough money to cover its own monthly utility bills. Sasha does not just run the massive company I work for. As of last Tuesday morning, she is legally your new commercial landlord." The sheer magnitude of the shocking revelation hit the family like a runaway freight train crashing through the front door. All the lies, all the subtle psychological gaslighting, and all the financial manipulation they had used to keep me firmly positioned at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. I was no longer the helpless, pathetic scapegoat they could bully and discard for their own twisted amusement. I held the entire legal deed to Monique's failing business right in the palm of my hand. Monique looked completely, fundamentally destroyed. Her beautiful emerald green dress was heavily stained with dark wine. Her wealthy, successful boyfriend was looking at her with absolute total revulsion, and her entire false narrative of superiority was suddenly exposed to the entire family as a complete, pathetic sham. She slowly looked over at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization that I held the ultimate power to evict her failing business and ruin her life with a single quick phone call to my legal team. I maintained my calm, perfectly neutral expression. I did not gloat, and I did not smile triumphantly. I just stood there quietly on the snowy porch, letting the freezing winter wind blow past me as the ultimate, undeniable truth finally settled over the deeply toxic household. I slowly shifted my calm gaze from my shattered older sister to my parents standing in the doorway. I expected my father to be absolutely furious. I expected Calvin to start yelling at the top of his lungs and demanding that I leave his property immediately for intentionally humiliating his favorite daughter on a holiday. I expected my mother Brenda to start crying hysterically and begging me not to hurt her precious golden child. But that is not what happened at all. Calvin stood perfectly still, his broad, heavy shoulders tense under his holiday sweater. He looked at the glowing screen of Connor's smartphone, and then he slowly looked back at me standing in the cold. The deep anger and blatant disdain that had violently contorted his face just moments ago completely melted away like ice on a hot stove. Brenda's face underwent the exact same chilling psychological transformation. The harsh, bitter lines of irritation around her mouth suddenly softened into something deeply, deeply unnatural. Their familiar facial expressions froze completely for a split second, and then morphed instantly from deep, arrogant disdain into a look of purely calculated financial greed. My mother Brenda was the first one to break the eerie, heavy silence. She stepped forward onto the freezing, snowy porch, completely ignoring the bitter winter wind that was actively blowing into the hallway. The silver tray of appetizers was quickly shoved onto the entryway console table. She reached out and grabbed my arm with both of her hands, her grip surprisingly tight and desperate. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant daughter!" Brenda cooed, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickeningly sweet fake warmth that made my stomach physically churn. "Why are you standing out here in the freezing cold? Come inside right now. Take off your heavy coat and sit down at the dinner table with your family." She tugged at my sleeve, pulling me across the threshold and into the warm, brightly lit hallway, as if the previous 10 minutes had never even happened. There was absolutely no apology for trying to ban me from the house on a holiday. There was no remorse for the cruel things they had all just said about me. In Brenda's mind, the sudden shocking revelation of my massive corporate wealth acted as a magical psychological eraser, completely wiping away decades of horrific emotional abuse and blatant neglect. She looked at me not with a mother's genuine pride or love, but with the frantic, calculating eyes of a desperate woman who had just realized she was standing next to a winning multi-million-dollar lottery ticket. I let her pull me into the dining room, my black leather heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor, right past the massive dark red wine stain that Connor had just been frantically trying to clean. Connor was still standing rigidly against the hallway wall, looking completely nauseous and terrified to even breathe in my direction. Monique was trailing silently behind us, her face pale and her expensive silk dress ruined, looking exactly like a spoiled, entitled child who had just been violently informed that the world did not actually revolve around her. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted so drastically, it felt like walking directly into an alternate dimension. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence, who had just been loudly mocking my entire existence and my relationship status from the living room sofa, were now standing right by the dining table with wide, eager smiles plastered across their faces. Yvonne rushed forward and hastily pulled out a heavy carved oak dining chair for me at the center of the table. "Sit right here, sweetheart," Yvonne insisted, her voice trembling with a disgusting amount of forced affection. "Let me get you a fresh hot plate of food. You must be absolutely starving and exhausted after running such a massive, important company all day." I did not sit down. I remained standing right behind the heavy oak chair, resting my gloved hands casually on the carved wooden backrest. I looked around the lavishly decorated room, taking in the pathetic sight of the people who shared my blood, but had never once shared their love or support. This was the exact toxic financial entitlement that infected so many dysfunctional families, especially ours. When you are struggling and trying to build a foundation from nothing, they treat you like an absolute burden. They call you arrogant for dreaming big, and they slam the door right in your face when you ask for the absolute smallest amount of emotional or financial support. I thought about the years I spent eating cheap noodles in a freezing tiny apartment while they posted pictures of their lavish family vacations online. I thought about the times I called home crying because my electricity was shut off, and Calvin told me it was a good character-building lesson in personal responsibility. But the very second you become incredibly successful, despite all of their constant sabotage, the rules of personal responsibility are instantly thrown out the window. They suddenly develop a severe, convenient case of amnesia. Your hard-earned money suddenly becomes family money. Your vast resources become their divine birthright. You stop being the family scapegoat and instantly transform into the family bank account. The successful Black woman is always expected to carry the heavy financial weight of the entire extended family without ever asking for a simple thank you or an apology. We are expected to be the mule, the endless provider, the silent workhorse who fixes everyone else's terrible life choices. My father, Calvin, walked slowly into the dining room and took his usual seat at the absolute head of the long table. He did not look embarrassed or ashamed of his previous behavior. The initial shock on his face had completely vanished and was quickly replaced by a thick layer of unearned, arrogant authority. He picked up a heavy silver butter knife and tapped it sharply against his crystal water glass. The sharp ringing sound commanded the immediate attention of everyone in the room. Calvin cleared his throat, puffing out his chest under his burgundy holiday sweater. He looked at me not as a daughter he had deeply wronged, but as a highly lucrative asset he now intended to fully manage and control. Good, Calvin announced, his deep voice booming across the dining table, echoing off the walls. If you are really the boss of that massive company, then this changes things completely. This is actually a massive financial blessing for this family. We are going to handle this situation right now, like adults. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the white lace tablecloth, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that he had literally just tried to banish me into the snow 5 minutes ago. First thing tomorrow morning, you are going to call your human resources department and double Connor's salary, Calvin ordered, waving his hand dismissively, as if he were simply ordering a side dish at a cheap restaurant. He is practically your brother-in-law, and he deserves to be compensated properly for dealing with the high-level corporate stress of your company. Second, you are going to wire $50,000 directly into Monique's checking account by the end of the week. Her new spa business is going through a rough patch, and her credit cards are completely maxed out right now. Brenda nodded eagerly from the other side of the table, her eyes shining with absolute, unfiltered greed. Yes, exactly, Brenda chimed in enthusiastically. Family takes care of family, Sasha. You are incredibly rich now, and you do not even have a husband or children to spend all that money on. It is only right that you help your sister get back on her feet so she can plan her future with Connor. Calvin slammed his heavy hand flat against the table to finalize his ruling. You are wealthy now, Sasha, so you need to step up and do your duty to us. He demanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. We keep the money in the family. That is exactly how this works. You owe us that much for everything we have done for you. I looked at the greedy, expectant faces surrounding the dining table. I looked at my father, acting like a king demanding a massive financial tribute from a peasant. I looked at my mother, nodding along happily to his blatant extortion. I looked at Monique, who had suddenly stopped crying and was now staring at me with a renewed sense of arrogant entitlement, fully expecting me to pay off her massive debts simply because we shared the same last name. They were all waiting quietly for me to pull out my checkbook and buy my way into their conditional fake affection. I stared directly into my father's eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but freezing cold, utter indifference. And I gave him my final answer. I am not giving any of you a single goddamn cent. The heavy silence returned to the dining room, but this time it was thick with a sudden violent tension. Calvin's face turned a deep, mottled shade of purple. He gripped the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp, as if I had just physically slapped her across the face. How dare you speak to me like that in my own house? Calvin roared, his voice shaking the delicate crystal glasses on the table. After everything we have done to raise you and put a roof over your head, you are going to sit here and hoard your millions while your own sister struggles to survive? You are a selfish, ungrateful little brat, and you always have been. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I just looked at him with the exact same cold, analytical stare I used during hostile corporate takeovers. I decided it was finally time to strip away all the emotional manipulation and break this family dynamic down into cold, hard, undeniable math. Let us talk about being selfish, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. Let us talk about family investments. Do you remember exactly 5 years ago when Monique decided she wanted to be a high-end fashion influencer? She convinced you to liquidate exactly $200,000 from your retirement fund so she could open that pathetic luxury clothing boutique downtown. The one that went completely bankrupt in less than 8 months because she spent all the inventory money on lavish trips to Miami and designer shoes for herself. Calvin opened his mouth to shout, but I immediately cut him off, slicing through his anger with pure, ruthless logic. Did you ever see a single penny of that $200,000 returned to your bank account? I asked, staring him down. No, you did not. And when I came to you exactly 2 months later begging for a simple $500 loan just so I could buy my required textbooks for my college business classes, what did you tell me? You told me that I was a drain on the family finances and that I needed to learn how to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. Brenda tried to interject, waving her hands frantically across the table. Now, Sasha, you know we were very tight on cash back then because of your sister's business struggles. It is not fair to bring up the past right now. I turned my deadpan stare directly onto my mother. It is entirely fair to bring up the past when you are trying to extort my present, I told her. While you were eagerly funding Monique's endless delusions of grandeur, I was working 3 separate waitressing jobs just to keep my electricity turned on. I worked the early morning shift at a greasy diner, the afternoon shift at a local coffee shop, and the night shift at a cheap sports bar. I slept 3 hours a night on a dirty mattress on the floor, while you guys bought Monique a brand new car because she was feeling depressed about her failed boutique. I looked back at Calvin, refusing to let him look away from the ugly financial truth. So tell me, Dad, I asked, my voice echoing loudly off the dining room walls. Where exactly was this beautiful concept of keeping the money in the family when I was starving and working myself to the absolute bone? Why is it that family duty only ever applies to my bank account and never to hers? The numbers simply do not add up. You did not invest in me, you completely abandoned me, so you have absolutely no right to demand a return on an investment you never made. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence shifted very uncomfortably in their heavy oak seats, entirely unable to argue with the brutal financial reality I had just laid out on the table. The room was completely stripped of its usual comforting illusions. I had taken their favorite narrative of the ungrateful younger daughter and completely destroyed it using their own terrible financial history. Connor was still standing near the hallway archway, listening to every single word. He looked physically sick to his stomach. He was a highly paid director of risk management. His entire corporate career was based on analyzing bad investments and identifying massive financial liabilities. Hearing that my father had drained $200,000 from a retirement fund for a business that failed in 8 months made him look at my parents like they were completely financially illiterate. He looked at Monique like she was a massive walking liability. Monique saw the look of utter disgust on Connor's face, and it absolutely terrified her. She knew the harsh financial truth was the one thing that could permanently break her relationship with him. She could not let him believe that she was a financial parasite who drained her own parents dry and expected her younger sister to bail her out. She realized instantly that she was rapidly losing her tight grip on the room. She could not argue with the math. She could not deny that she had squandered hundreds of thousands of dollars while I built a multi-million-dollar empire entirely from scratch. Her false, carefully curated image as the successful, beautiful business owner was lying dead on the dining room floor next to the shattered wine glass. She slammed both of her hands down on the dining table, making the expensive silverware rattle loudly. Tears began to well up in her eyes, perfectly on cue. So she did the only thing a true narcissist knows how to do when they are backed tightly into a corner by the undeniable truth. She violently shifted the narrative and decided to play the ultimate victim. Monique pushed her heavy dining chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. She stood up so fast that her crystal water glass wobbled dangerously before tipping over completely and spilling cold water across the pristine white lace tablecloth. She ignored the spreading mess entirely, her eyes fixed aggressively on me, with a level of pure, unhinged hatred I had never seen from her before. "You are such a massive, pathetic liar, Sasha," Monique screamed, her voice cracking with forced, dramatic emotion. "You expect everyone in this room to believe that you just magically built a multi-million-dollar company all by yourself? You have no real connections and no real talent. The only way a miserable girl like you could ever get that much money is if you were running some kind of massive illegal scam or sleeping your way straight to the top of the corporate ladder." Aunt Yvonne let out a loud, scandalized gasp, her hand fluttering nervously up to her chest. "Oh my goodness, Monique, that is a terrible thing to say," Yvonne whispered loudly, but her eyes were gleaming with sick fascination. She was absolutely loving every single second of the drama. I did not raise my voice in response. I just let her wild accusations hang heavily in the air, highlighting exactly how incredibly desperate and pathetic she sounded. When you are dealing with a classic narcissist who is rapidly losing their carefully constructed false reality, they will always resort to the most aggressive and disgusting personal attacks they can think of. They cannot handle being exposed as a failure, so they try to drag you down into the mud with them. "I am not a liar, Monique," I replied calmly, my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "The financial records are completely public. My corporate acquisitions are fully documented, and my tax returns are filed perfectly every single year. I did not have to sleep with anyone or steal anything to build my success. I actually had to work for it. I know hard work is a completely foreign concept to you since you have spent your entire adult life treating our parents like a personal, unlimited ATM machine." Monique let out a furious, shrill cry. She spun around wildly and marched over to where Connor was still standing rigidly near the hallway archway. She reached out and grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deeply into his expensive suit jacket. "Are you just going to stand there and let her disrespect me like this, Connor?" Monique demanded, shaking his arm aggressively. "Defend me right now. Tell them she is a lying, manipulative snake. Tell them you make more money than she does and that she is just a low-level employee at your massive company. Tell them the truth right now." Connor looked down at her hands gripping his jacket and then slowly looked up at her contorted, furious face. The profound illusion that Monique had spent the last 6 months carefully building for him was completely shattered beyond repair. He had believed she was an independent, driven, wealthy business owner who came from a respectable, affluent family. Instead, he was staring at a spoiled, deeply entitled financial parasite who was actively throwing a massive toddler tantrum because she could not extort $50,000 from her younger sister to pay off her massive credit card debts. Connor gently but very firmly grabbed her wrists and physically removed her hands from his suit jacket. He took a deliberate step backward, putting immediate physical distance between them. "Sasha is not lying, Monique," Connor said, his voice low and incredibly strained. "She is the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. She owns the entire private equity firm. She is my boss. And honestly, right now, I am deeply embarrassed to even be standing in the same room as you." Monique stumbled backward, as if he had just struck her across the face. Her mouth fell completely open, and her breathing became shallow and erratic. She looked frantically around the dining room, desperately searching for anyone to validate her rapidly crumbling false reality. She looked at my mother Brenda, who was now staring down at her plate of food, completely refusing to make eye contact with anyone. She looked at Uncle Terence, who was suddenly deeply interested in examining the intricate pattern on the wallpaper. Her entire world was collapsing, and she had absolutely nobody to blame but herself. Her long-established manipulative, gaslighting nature, the exact same toxic behavior she had used to control and abuse me for our entire lives, was finally fully exposed under the bright, harsh lights of the dining room for her new wealthy boyfriend to see. But there was still one person left in the room who would always violently defend her delusions, no matter how incredibly toxic or mathematically impossible they were. There was still one person who would rather burn the entire family to the ground than admit his perfect golden child was actually a massive failure. My father Calvin abruptly pushed his heavy chair back and stood up to his full imposing height. He slammed both of his large fists down onto the dining table with such explosive force that the heavy silverware jumped and rattled loudly against the plates. The sudden violent noise echoed sharply through the tense room, silencing everyone instantly. "You listen to me right now, you arrogant little girl," Calvin spat, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl that used to terrify me when I was a child. "You think because you have a fancy title and a big bank account that you can just waltz into my house and disrespect your own flesh and blood. You think you are completely untouchable now." He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with exertion. "I know exactly how these massive corporate companies work, Sasha. They care about their public image more than anything else. They care about morals and ethics and community standing. How do you think your wealthy investors and your elite board of directors are going to react when your own father shows up in the main lobby of your pristine corporate headquarters holding a protest sign? How will they feel when I tell them that the brilliant chief executive officer they trusted with their millions is actually a cruel, heartless monster who leaves her own sister to drown in absolute poverty? Brenda gasped, but quickly nodded in agreement, finding her courage now that her husband had taken firm control of the room. "That is right, Calvin," she whispered loudly. "You tell her. And it will not just be your corporate office," Calvin continued, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. "I will go straight to Pastor Thomas at the First Baptist Church tomorrow morning. I will get on the church Facebook group tonight, and I will write a massive public post detailing exactly how abusive and ungrateful you are. I will tell the entire congregation that you turned your back on the loving family that raised you in the church. I will tell all the church elders that you are financially starving your parents while you sit up high in your luxury penthouse. You know exactly how fast gossip spreads in our community, Sasha. By Sunday morning, you will be an absolute pariah. Your professional reputation in this city will be completely dragged through the mud and destroyed." Aunt Yvonne chimed in from the corner, her voice trembling with fake righteous indignation. "Your father is absolutely right, Sasha. A good Christian woman does not abandon her family when she is blessed with financial abundance. What would the Lord think of your incredible selfishness tonight? You should be deeply ashamed of yourself." This was his ultimate weapon. For my entire life, my parents had used the strict moral authority of the Black church and the heavy pressure of the local community to keep me completely in line. Whenever I tried to speak up about the blatant unfairness in our house, they would threaten to tell the pastor that I was a rebellious, sinful child. They cared more about maintaining their flawless Christian image to the neighbors than they ever cared about my actual well-being. It was incredibly sickening how quickly they could twist religion to justify their own blatant financial extortion. The church was never a place of spiritual sanctuary for me. It was a social courtroom where my parents constantly put me on trial to ensure I remained obedient. They were perfectly willing to weaponize their faith and their community standing to extort me for cash right in front of a complete stranger. Calvin reached into the inner pocket of his sweater and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slamming it down onto the dining table right next to the spilled water. "This is a commercial loan application," he demanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "It is for a $100,000 line of credit to save Monique's business and consolidate her personal credit card debts. Since you refuse to just give her the cash outright, you are going to co-sign this loan right here, right now. Your massive corporate income and your perfect credit score will guarantee the immediate approval. You are going to sign on the dotted line tonight, Sasha, or I swear to God I will make it my personal mission to ruin your perfect little empire by tomorrow morning." Monique wiped her fake tears and looked up at me with a smug, triumphant smirk creeping back onto her face. She honestly believed her daddy had just saved the day again. She believed that the heavy threat of public humiliation and professional ruin would be enough to force me back into my designated role as the obedient, submissive financial mule for the family. She thought I would crumble just like I always did when I was a frightened teenager. Connor watched the entire extortion attempt unfold with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He was actively watching a father blackmail his own successful daughter, using the church and corporate sabotage as leverage just to fund his other daughter's shopping addiction. It was a level of extreme psychological toxicity that his rational brain could barely process. He took another step away from Monique, looking at the entire family like they were covered in a highly contagious disease. The heavy silence descended on the dining room once again. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to look down at the floor, apologize for my temporary rebellion, and reach into my designer purse for a pen to sign away my hard-earned credit score. They fully expected the old terrified Sasha to resurface under the crushing weight of their collective emotional blackmail. I looked down at the folded loan application resting on the wet white lace tablecloth. I looked up at my father's red, furious face. I looked at my mother's eager, greedy eyes and my sister's smug, entitled smirk. I looked at Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence waiting eagerly for my total submission. And then something inside me completely snapped. But it was not a break of submission or fear. It was a massive, overwhelming release of tension that had been building inside my chest for the last 2 decades. I threw my head back and I started to laugh. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a loud, genuine, chilling laugh that erupted from the very bottom of my chest and echoed terrifyingly loud against the high ceilings of the dining room, making my father physically flinch. My laughter finally subsided, leaving the dining room in a state of absolute chilling silence. I wiped a single tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye and looked directly at my father, who was still standing there, holding his ridiculous commercial loan application. "You want to go to the church?" I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly calm whisper that carried across the room. "You want to stand in front of Pastor Thomas and the entire congregation tomorrow morning and tell them about our family finances. I think that is a fantastic idea, Dad. You should absolutely do that." Calvin frowned, his thick brows pulling together in deep confusion. He had fully expected me to beg him to keep my name out of the church gossip circles. He did not expect me to eagerly encourage his threat. "But when you stand up at that podium," I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the dining table, "make sure you tell the congregation the complete truth. Make sure you explain to all the church elders exactly why you are so desperate for me to co-sign a $100,000 loan tonight. Make sure you tell them that you and Mom are not actually struggling because of inflation or the economy like you have been crying about for months. Tell them the real reason you are completely broke." Brenda let out a sharp, terrified squeak. "Calvin, Sasha, please," she begged, her face suddenly turning an ashen shade of gray. "Let us just keep family business inside the family. There is no need to bring this up right now." "No, Mom," I said sharply, cutting her off. "Dad wanted to make this public, so we are going to make it public." I turned to look at Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence, who were watching the exchange with wide, eager eyes. "You guys remember last summer, right?" I asked them. "You remember when Monique came over for the 4th of July barbecue, driving that brand new white Porsche Cayenne? She told everyone she bought it herself because her luxury spa was doing so incredibly well. And do you remember when she spent the entire month of August posting hundreds of pictures on social media from her luxury vacation in Paris, wearing thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes?" Aunt Yvonne nodded slowly, her eyes darting nervously between me and Monique. "Yes, I remember," Yvonne said, her voice filled with sudden creeping suspicion. "We were all so proud of her for being so successful and independent. She is not successful, Aunt Yvonne." I revealed, my voice ringing with cold, hard truth. "She is a complete fraud. Her spa has been operating at a massive loss for over a year. She did not buy that Porsche and she did not pay for that Paris vacation. My parents paid for all of it." Uncle Terence scoffed, waving his large hand dismissively. "That is impossible," he said. "Calvin and Brenda do not have that kind of cash lying around. Calvin retired 3 years ago and his pension barely covers their medical bills." "They did not have the cash," I agreed, maintaining eye contact with my uncle. "So they did the absolute most reckless and stupid thing a person can do. 14 months ago, my father secretly went to a predatory lending company and took out a $400,000 second mortgage on this exact house." The collective gasp from Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence was so loud it sucked all the oxygen out of the dining room. This was not just any house. This was the ancestral family home that had been passed down from my grandparents. It was a sacred piece of generational wealth. It was supposed to be completely paid off, a secure legacy for the entire family. The undeniable fact that Calvin had secretly mortgaged it to fund Monique's superficial lifestyle was a massive, unforgivable betrayal to the entire extended family. "You did what?" Uncle Terence yelled, jumping up from his heavy oak chair. His face was contorted with pure, genuine rage. The veins in his neck were bulging against his collar. "Calvin, tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you did not put a second mortgage on our parents' house so this spoiled little brat could drive a luxury car. Calvin opened his mouth, but he could not find a single word to defend himself. His silence was the only confirmation Terence needed. Aunt Yvonne clutched her chest, looking at my mother with absolute, utter disgust. "You two have lost your damn minds," Yvonne screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Brenda. "You put the family home at risk for a trip to Paris, and now you have the absolute audacity to sit here and demand that Sasha bail you out because you cannot afford the monthly payments." The united front the family had maintained against me for my entire life completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. They were no longer allied against the family scapegoat. They were actively turning on each other, ripping each other apart like wild animals over the sickening financial truth. The pristine Christian family image they loved to project to the neighborhood was officially dead and buried. Monique was backed against the dining room wall, her face pale and her eyes wide with sheer panic. Her perfect illusion was entirely destroyed. Everyone in the room now knew that she was nothing but a massive financial parasite sucking her parents dry to maintain a fake wealthy image. Connor stood near the archway, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the dysfunction unfolding before him. He was a numbers guy, a director of risk management who spent his days analyzing terrible financial decisions. He rapidly calculated the financial reality playing out in front of him. A $400,000 second mortgage at a predatory interest rate meant my parents were bleeding cash every single month just to cover the minimum payments. It meant they were financially drowning and facing absolute ruin, all so their precious golden child could pretend to be rich to her friends. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at Monique. His eyes traveled down from her ruined emerald green silk dress to the chair resting right next to her. Sitting casually on the dining room chair was the brand new black quilted Chanel handbag she had eagerly shown off to him just yesterday. She had specifically told him she bought it as a well-deserved reward for closing a massive corporate client at her spa. Connor stared at the expensive designer bag. He knew exactly how much that specific piece cost. He knew that bag was purchased with money stolen from a retired couple's home, equity money extorted through severe emotional blackmail money that was currently destroying an entire family legacy. A look of absolute visceral disgust washed over his face as he stared at the horrible woman he had once mistakenly loved. Connor took a slow, heavy step into the center of the dining room, completely ignoring my father, who was still holding that ridiculous loan application. He did not look angry in the traditional sense. He looked completely hollowed out, like a man who had just woken up from a very long and very expensive nightmare. He looked right at the black quilted Chanel handbag sitting on the chair, and then he looked directly into Monique's panicked eyes. "You told me you were a business heiress," Connor said, his voice eerily calm and flat in the tense room. "You looked me dead in the eye on our first date and told me that you came from a long line of successful real estate developers. You said your luxury spa was generating so much revenue that you were thinking about expanding to a second location in the Gold Coast neighborhood. You told me that bag was a gift to yourself for hitting your quarterly profit margins early." Monique swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "Connor, please, let us just go outside and talk about this in private," she pleaded, reaching out her hand toward him. "My sister is just trying to start drama because she is jealous of what we have. She is making all of this up to ruin my life and sabotage our beautiful relationship." Connor slapped her hand away so fast it made a sharp cracking sound. "Do not touch me," he growled, stepping back. "Do not even try to spin this into another one of your pathetic lies. Your own uncle just confirmed the second mortgage. Your father just tried to blackmail your sister into signing a commercial loan to bail you out. There is no massive profit margin, Monique. There is no real estate empire. You are a complete fraud living off money that your parents literally stole from their own retirement and their own house." Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence watched the confrontation in stunned silence. The entire family was finally witnessing the complete and total disintegration of Monique's carefully crafted facade. She was not the independent, wealthy woman they had all bragged about to the church congregation. She was a manipulative parasite, and her wealthy boyfriend was currently stripping her bare in front of everyone. Brenda tried to intervene her maternal instinct to protect her golden child, overriding her common sense. Now, Connor, you have to understand that starting a business is very hard. Brenda stuttered nervously, gripping the edge of the dining table. Monique is just going through a temporary rough patch right now. The economy is terrible, but she is a very smart girl, and she will turn it around soon. You two love each other, and that is what really matters. Connor let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark. A temporary rough patch, he repeated, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. Is that what you call it, Brenda? Is that what you call manipulating your elderly parents into risking their entire ancestral home so your daughter can play dress up and pretend to be rich on the internet? You people are absolutely delusional. I have worked in risk management for my entire adult life, and I have never seen a family so financially destructive and morally bankrupt. He turned his attention back to Monique, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of pure contempt. And to think I actually felt sorry for you last week, Connor said, his voice dripping with venom. When you came crying to my apartment saying your corporate bank account was temporarily frozen due to a clerical error, I actually believed you. I thought you were just a stressed-out business owner dealing with bad banking bureaucracy. Monique's face instantly drained of whatever little color it had left. She took a frantic step back, bumping into the dining room wall. Connor, stop, she whispered, her eyes darting toward me and then back to him in pure terror. Please do not say another word in front of them. But Connor was not going to protect her dirty secrets anymore. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out his leather wallet. His hands were perfectly steady now, driven by a cold, calculating anger. He opened the wallet, pulled out a sleek platinum credit card, and threw it onto the dining table. The plastic card landed right next to Calvin's folded loan application with a sharp clatter. You told me you needed to borrow my card to cover your employee payroll for a few days, Connor announced to the entire room, refusing to let her hide. You swore to me that the funds would clear by Monday and you would pay me back immediately. You looked me right in the face and cried real tears. But my accounting department flagged the card yesterday morning. You did not use that money to pay any employees, Monique. You swiped my personal credit card for $15,000 at a luxury jewelry boutique downtown and another $3,000 at a designer shoe store. You literally stole from me to fund your fake lifestyle. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Uncle Terence threw his hands in the air, muttering a string of angry curses under his breath. Aunt Yvonne covered her face with her hands, shaking her head in profound disgust. Calvin and Brenda stood completely frozen, unable to comprehend that their perfect angel was not just a terrible business owner, but an actual petty thief who was actively stealing from the man she claimed to love. I stood silently by my chair, watching the entire toxic foundation of my family collapse in real time. Monique had spent her entire life stealing from everyone around her. She stole our parents' attention, she stole their retirement funds, she stole the equity in our family home, and now she had stolen $18,000 from the man she was trying to trap into a marriage. Her entitlement knew absolutely no bounds, and her greed had finally caught up with her in the most spectacular way possible. Monique realized there was no easy way out of this trap. The financial evidence was completely stacked against her, and her carefully constructed lies were scattered all over the dining room floor. The sophisticated, wealthy image she had built was entirely gone, replaced by the ugly reality of a desperate broke thief standing in a ruined silk dress. She looked around the room, seeing the heavy disgust on her aunt's face, the utter shock on her parents' faces, and the cold indifference on mine. But she could not handle being the villain of her own story. Her narcissism simply would not allow her to accept any accountability for her own terrible actions. She desperately needed someone to blame, and she needed to regain control over the one person who could still potentially save her from absolute financial ruin. She straightened her posture, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. She looked Connor dead in the eye and decided to play her final, most manipulative card. She truly thought that by forcing him to make a public choice, she could prove that his blind love for her was somehow stronger than his sense of basic morality and self-preservation. "This is all Sasha's fault," Monique screamed, pointing a trembling finger right at me. "She planned this entire thing to embarrass me because she is a bitter, lonely woman, and if you really love me, Connor, you will not let her get away with this. You are going to make a choice right here, right now. Either you quit her company right this second and walk out that front door with me, or we are completely done." Connor stared at Monique for what felt like an eternity. The dining room was so incredibly quiet that I could actually hear the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. He looked at her extended, trembling finger pointing at me, and then he looked at her tear-stained, contorted face. She had just delivered the most absurd and financially suicidal ultimatum in the history of human relationships. She genuinely expected a highly educated professional man to throw away his entire lucrative corporate career just to stroke her shattered ego and validate her psychotic lies. Connor let out a loud, sharp scoff that cut through the heavy silence like a physical knife. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He shook his head slowly, a bitter smile creeping onto his face as the absolute sheer audacity of her demand finally registered in his logical brain. "You want me to quit my job?" Connor asked, his voice echoing with cold, harsh incredulity. "You want me to walk away from a position that pays me $350,000 a year? You want me to surrender my executive stock options, my comprehensive health benefits, and my entire professional reputation in the corporate financial sector of Chicago? And you want me to do all of that for what exactly? So I can walk out that front door with a desperate broke thief who steals from my wallet when I am sleeping?" Monique flinched, as if he had just thrown a glass of cold water directly into her face. "Connor, please do not say those things," she whimpered, her false bravado instantly crumbling under the crushing weight of his logical rejection. "We can fix this. We can move past this and start over." "There is absolutely nothing to fix because there was never anything real between us," Connor stated firmly, his tone completely devoid of any remaining affection or sympathy. "Every single thing you ever told me about yourself from the very first night we met was a carefully calculated lie. You are not a business owner, Monique. You are a manipulative scammer. You do not love me. You only love the fact that my credit limit was high enough to fund your pathetic delusions of grandeur." He did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or another desperate lie. He turned his back on her, completely dismissing her existence entirely. He walked purposefully out of the dining room and stepped into the brightly lit hallway. He marched straight over to the heavy wooden coat rack standing near the front door. He reached up and grabbed his expensive tailored winter overcoat, pulling it down with a swift, decisive motion. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence watched him moving with wide, shocked eyes. They had always been the biggest cheerleaders for Monique's fake successful life. They had constantly praised her for securing such a wealthy, handsome white man to elevate the family status. And now they were watching that exact same man actively running for the hills, leaving their golden child exposed as a massive financial liability. My father Calvin finally seemed to snap out of his paralyzed state. He dropped the folded loan application onto the wet tablecloth and rushed out of the dining room chasing after Connor. "Wait just a minute, son," Calvin pleaded, his deep voice sounding incredibly desperate and weak. "Let us not make any hasty decisions tonight. Emotions are running very high right now. Monique made a terrible mistake, but she is a good Christian girl deep down. We can sit down and work out a payment plan for the money she took from you. We can keep this entirely in the family." Connor paused as he was slipping his left arm into the sleeve of his heavy winter coat. He turned his head and looked at my father with a level of profound disgust that made Calvin physically take a step backward. "Do not ever call me your son," Connor warned, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "You are just as morally bankrupt as she is, Calvin. You secretly mortgaged your own family home to buy her a luxury car, and then you tried to blackmail your other daughter using the church just to cover up your massive financial failures. You people do not understand the concept of family. You only understand extortion. If any of you ever try to contact me again, I will immediately press formal grand theft charges against Monique for the credit card fraud. I have all the bank statements and I will not hesitate to ruin her life exactly like she tried to ruin mine. Calvin stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning completely pale. The threat of police involvement and formal criminal charges completely shattered any remaining illusions of control he thought he had over the situation. He slowly backed away from the coat rack, entirely defeated by the cold, hard legal reality Connor had just presented. Connor finished putting on his coat and adjusted his collar. He did not even look back into the dining room. He simply reached out, turned the heavy brass doorknob, and pulled the front door open, letting a massive blast of freezing Chicago winter air swirl into the suffocatingly toxic house. He walked out into the falling snow, pulling the door firmly shut behind him, with a loud, decisive click. The sound of the door closing echoed through the silent house, signaling the absolute end of the alliance. The wealthy boyfriend, the golden meal ticket, the man who was supposed to fund Monique's lavish lifestyle for the rest of her life, was completely gone, and he was never coming back. Monique stood frozen in the center of the dining room, staring blankly at the empty hallway. The reality of what had just happened crashed down onto her shoulders like a ton of heavy concrete. She had lost her rich boyfriend, she had lost her fake business, she had lost the respect of her entire extended family, and she was officially exposed as a common thief. Her entire world had been completely annihilated in the span of 30 minutes. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. I was still standing calmly by my heavy oak dining chair, completely unaffected by the absolute chaos unfolding around me. I had not yelled, I had not thrown any tantrums, and I had not shed a single tear. I simply told the truth and watched her completely destroy her own life. The look in Monique's eyes shifted from sheer panic into something deeply dark and entirely unstable. All the careful, psychological masks she had worn for years violently peeled away, revealing the terrifying, unhinged monster lurking underneath. Having lost everything she valued in the world, she let out a guttural, completely primal scream and went absolutely feral. Monique did not just cry or yell, she completely lost her mind. She launched herself across the dining room, moving with a terrifying, animalistic speed. Her hands were raised, her manicured acrylic nails curved like actual claws, aiming directly for my face. She wanted to physically tear my skin apart because she could not handle the fact that I had just torn her fake life apart. Her ruined emerald green silk dress whipped around her legs as she closed the distance between us, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly, unhinged rage. She was screaming something completely incoherent, a string of vicious curses and frantic denials, but I did not flinch or even raise my hands to defend myself. I just stood there calmly watching her completely self-destruct. Before she could even reach me, her expensive designer heel caught hard on the thick wooden leg of the heavy oak dining chair she had violently pushed back earlier. The sudden violent shift in momentum sent her flying forward entirely out of control. She hit the polished hardwood floor with a massive, sickening thud. Her knees and elbows took the brutal force of the impact, and she slid slightly across the spilled water and the tiny remnants of the shattered crystal glass. Brenda let out a blood-curdling shriek, as if she had just watched her golden child get struck by a moving vehicle. She dropped to her knees right next to Monique, frantically grabbing her shoulders and checking her for injuries. "Oh, my poor baby!" Brenda wailed, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that her poor baby had just attempted to physically assault me in a blind rage. "Are you hurt? Let Mama help you up." Monique was sobbing hysterically. Now her face pressed against the cold, wet floor, her perfect, expensive makeup smeared and completely ruined. She pounded her fists against the hardwood, throwing a literal temper tantrum like a spoiled toddler who had been told no for the very first time in her entire life. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence pressed themselves flat against the far wall of the dining room, looking absolutely terrified by the sheer level of violent dysfunction exploding right in front of them. They had always enjoyed the subtle passive-aggressive family drama, and the quiet gossiping but actual physical violence was a firm line they never expected to see crossed at a family Christmas dinner. That was the exact moment when Calvin completely lost his mind. Seeing his precious golden child lying on the floor crying hysterically shattered whatever tiny shred of sanity he had left in his brain. He could not accept that Monique was at fault. His massive, fragile ego would never allow him to admit that he had bankrupted his own family for a manipulative thief. He needed a villain to blame for this massive catastrophe, and I was the only target available. He stomped across the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. His chest was heaving, his face was completely purple, and the thick veins in his neck looked like they were about to explode under his burgundy holiday sweater. He raised his large hand and pointed a trembling, thick finger straight toward the front door. "You are a demon!" Calvin roared, his deep voice vibrating through the floorboards and shaking the expensive picture frames hanging on the walls. "You came into this house tonight with the sole intention of destroying your sister and humiliating this family. You are pure evil, Sasha. You are a selfish, vindictive little monster, and I curse the day you were ever born." His words were carefully designed to absolutely crush my spirit. For 20 years, those exact words would have sent me into a severe spiral of deep depression and endless apologies. I would have fallen to my knees and begged for his forgiveness just to keep the peace. But tonight, standing in my tailored coat, with my multi-million-dollar empire waiting for me back in the city, his vicious words simply bounced right off me. They meant absolutely nothing at all. "Get out of my house!" Calvin screamed, spit flying from his lips, as his anger reached a fever pitch. "Take your arrogant attitude and your filthy corporate money and get the hell out of my sight. I do not ever want to see your face in this house again. I would rather burn this ancestral home to the ground with my own two hands than give you the satisfaction of ever getting a single dime from us. You are not my daughter anymore. As of this exact second, you are completely dead to me." The entire dining room went completely dead silent again, broken only by the pathetic sound of Monique sobbing on the floor. The ultimate unforgivable severing of blood ties had just been officially declared. He had formally disowned me. He had looked his own flesh and blood directly in the eye and publicly cast me out of the family lineage, all to protect the bruised ego of a woman who was actively stealing from them. Uncle Terence shifted uncomfortably against the wall, his eyes wide with shock. Calvin had just threatened to burn down the home their parents had built with their own blood, sweat, and tears. It was a house that was supposed to represent strong generational wealth and familial safety for the entire bloodline. To hear Calvin speak about it with such reckless, violent disregard proved exactly how far gone he truly was. I felt a sudden massive weight lift completely off my shoulders. The heavy, suffocating chains of familial obligation that had been wrapping tightly around my neck and dragging me down since I was a little girl abruptly snapped and fell away into nothing. I did not have to pretend anymore. I did not have to try and win the conditional approval of people who were so fundamentally broken and deeply toxic. I was finally entirely free from their grasp. I looked at my father, my eyes completely cold and devoid of any remaining respect or love. I looked at the beautifully painted walls of the house my grandparents had built. A house that Calvin had secretly mortgaged to a predatory commercial lender just to keep up his pathetic superficial appearances. I nodded slowly, letting a very small, very chilling smile pull at the corners of my mouth as the ultimate absolute irony of his threat washed over me. "You are right, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly in the silent, ruined dining room. "You almost did burn it to the ground." I took a slow, deliberate step away from my chair, moving closer to where my father was standing. The chaotic energy in the room suddenly flatlined, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension that made it hard for anyone to breathe. The front door was still slightly ajar from Connor leaving, letting a steady stream of freezing winter air snake its way across the hardwood floor, but nobody moved to close it. Everyone was entirely captivated by the chilling calmness in my voice. You see, Dad, the funny thing about financial ignorance is that it always masquerades as extreme confidence. I said, my tone dropping into the exact same measured cadence I used during high-stakes boardroom negotiations. 14 months ago, when you walked into that shady strip mall office of Apex Financial Solutions, you genuinely thought you were a genius. You thought you had found a brilliant secret loophole to fund your favorite daughter's fake lifestyle without anyone in the family ever finding out. Calvin's chest stopped heaving. His purple face began to lose its color, draining away as I named the exact obscure lending company he had used. You signed the paperwork for a $400,000 second mortgage on this property. I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the dining table, my leather heels clicking softly against the wood. But you did not go to a traditional reputable bank, did you, Calvin? Traditional banks denied your applications because you are retired and you have zero verifiable income to support that kind of massive high-risk debt. Your debt-to-income ratio was a complete joke. So instead, you went to a subprime lender, a legal loan shark who saw an arrogant, financially illiterate old man coming from a mile away and decided to completely bleed him dry. Brenda let out a soft, pathetic whimper, pressing both of her hands over her mouth. Monique had stopped crying and was just staring at me from the floor, her ruined makeup smeared across her cheeks, looking entirely lost. They offered you an adjustable rate mortgage with a promotional teaser rate for the first 6 months. I explained, breaking down his catastrophic failure with the surgical precision of a corporate auditor. You saw the low initial monthly payment, and your massive ego took over. You eagerly signed on the dotted line, completely ignoring the massive red flags. You thought you could easily handle it. You thought Monique's fake luxury spa would magically take off and she would pay you back before the interest rate adjusted. But you did not bother to sit down and actually read the 50 pages of fine print, did you? I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out for several agonizing seconds, forcing him to live inside the suffocating reality of his own stupid mistakes. You did not read the tiny clause buried on page 32 about the ballooning interest rate, I said, pointing a steady finger right at him. You did not realize that after those 6 months were over, that promotional rate would violently skyrocket to an astronomical 19%. You did not understand the predatory prepayment penalties or the compounding daily late fees that were built directly into the contract. Those clauses are specifically designed by corporate lawyers to legally trap desperate, ignorant people just like you into an endless cycle of compounding debt. Uncle Terence groaned, rubbing his large hands roughly over his face in sheer disbelief. 19% on a $400,000 principal? Terence muttered, his deep voice shaking with horror. Calvin, you absolute fool. You signed a death warrant on our parents' house. You threw away 50 years of family equity for a car. I never meant for it to get this bad. Calvin stammered, his booming authoritative voice completely gone, replaced by the weak defensive stutter of a cornered animal. The broker told me the rate was standard for the current market. He looked me in the eye and said we could refinance next year when the economy got better. You cannot refinance a subprime loan when you are actively defaulting on the monthly payments. I shot back, slicing right through his pathetic excuses. And you are defaulting, Dad. You paid the teaser rate for the first 6 months using the very same loan money you borrowed. But when the rate finally adjusted to 19%, the payments tripled overnight. Your meager monthly pension could not even cover half of the new minimum balance. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of him, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. I wanted him to feel the full weight of the empire he had just burned down. You have not made a single payment in exactly 6 months. I revealed, my voice ringing with absolute finality in the quiet room. Not one single dime. For half a year you have been waking up early to secretly check the mailbox so you could hide the urgent past due notices from Mom. You have been screening phone calls from unknown numbers because the collection agents have been hunting you down. The late fees have been aggressively compounding every 30 days, pushing the total balance well past the original $400,000 you borrowed. You are completely financially underwater, and you are dragging the entire family legacy down into the dark abyss with you. The dining room was so completely quiet, I could actually hear the soft rustle of the snow hitting the window panes outside. Aunt Yvonne looked like she was going to physically pass out. She was gripping the back of a wooden chair so hard her knuckles were white. The pristine colonial house they were all currently standing in, the beautiful home that gave them their precious social status in the neighborhood, was essentially gone. It was already consumed by predatory debt and arrogant stupidity. Calvin stood there, his thick arms hanging limply at his sides. The terrifying, aggressive patriarch who had just screamed at me and violently disowned me was completely broken. His face was no longer flushed red with righteous anger. It was a sickly, pale shade of gray. His eyes darted around the room, realizing that every single person, his wife, his brother, his sister-in-law, and his precious golden child, was looking at him with profound disgust and intense pity. He was no longer the king of the castle. He was just an old, foolish man who had bankrupted his family for nothing. But then a sudden flicker of intense confusion crossed his pale face. His panicked, exhausted brain finally caught up to the incredible level of specific detail I had just recited to the room. He realized I knew the exact name of his obscure lender. I knew the exact terms of his adjustable-rate mortgage. I knew his exact current interest rate, and I knew his exact highly classified payment history, down to the very last month. Calvin swallowed hard, his throat working dryly. He took a small, trembling step toward me, looking at me as if I were a terrifying entity he could no longer comprehend. "How do you know all of that?" Calvin whispered, his voice shaking violently in the silent room. "That was a closed-door meeting. Nobody else was there. How the hell do you know about my private bank files?" "I did not hack into your bank account, Calvin," I answered, my voice perfectly even and devoid of any emotional inflection. "I did not bribe a bank teller to leak your personal information, and I certainly did not hire a private investigator to dig through your dirty financial secrets. The truth is actually much more simple and significantly more devastating than any conspiracy theory your panicked mind can come up with right now." I stepped fully away from the oak chair and walked into the absolute center of the dining room, allowing the warm glow of the crystal chandelier to cast a long shadow across the polished hardwood floor. Everyone in the room physically shrank back as I moved. I was no longer the disobedient daughter they could scold and banish. I was the executioner, and I was about to drop the blade on their entire false reality. I am not just some generic corporate employee who sits in a corner office answering emails. I continued looking at the pale, terrified faces surrounding me. I am the founder and sole owner of Apex Holdings, and it is time you learned exactly how my company built its massive financial empire. Apex Holdings is a private equity firm that specializes entirely in distressed asset acquisition. We deal in the brutal reality of bad debt. I looked directly into my father's wide, horrified eyes, making sure he understood every single corporate term I was about to lay out on the table. In the American financial market, when predatory subprime lenders like Apex Financial Solutions issue too many high-risk, toxic loans to financially illiterate people who cannot afford to pay them back, they eventually run into a massive liquidity crisis. Their corporate balance sheets become a complete disaster of defaulting accounts. Federal regulators start heavily auditing their practices, and their wealthy shareholders start demanding immediate liquid capital. To avoid filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, these desperate lenders are forced to clean up their books quickly. They take thousands of terrible defaulting loans just like yours. They bundle them all together into massive toxic portfolios, and they sell them off to private investment firms in bulk for pennies on the dollar. Uncle Terence was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, his breathing shallow and rapid. He worked in a low-level municipal government job, and he was finally grasping the sheer massive scale of the corporate world I operated in. "They sell that toxic debt to firms exactly like mine," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "My company swoops in with hundreds of millions of dollars in liquid corporate capital, and we buy those massive distressed portfolios outright. When we purchase that debt, We assume all the legal rights, all the contractual obligations, and most importantly, all the physical collateral tied to those original loans. When a borrower stops paying a subprime lender, the original broker gets desperate and panics. But when a private equity firm buys that defaulted debt, we are not desperate at all. We are highly calculated and completely ruthless. We possess the aggressive corporate legal teams, the unlimited financial resources, and the cold, ironclad patience to completely enforce the original contract to the absolute fullest extent of the law. Calvin's chest was rising and falling in quick, jagged jerks. The deep purple rage that had consumed his face just a few moments ago was completely replaced by a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He looked like a man who was actively having a massive coronary event right in the middle of his own dining room. You see, Dad, the world of high finance is incredibly small when you are operating at the very top of the corporate food chain, I explained, taking another slow, deliberate step toward him. Exactly 4 weeks ago, the executive board of Apex Holdings finalized a massive corporate acquisition. We purchased a sweeping portfolio of distressed residential debt from a struggling regional subprime lender that was desperately trying to liquidate its toxic assets before the end of the fiscal year. That specific regional lender was Apex Financial Solutions, the exact same shady strip mall company that currently holds the $400,000 second mortgage on this beautiful ancestral home. Calvin stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the dining table. He collapsed heavily into his large oak chair, the wood groaning loudly under his dead weight. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of my words finally crashed through his thick, arrogant skull. I did not just access your private bank files illegally, Calvin. I revealed, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I own your private bank files. I own the original digital copies. I own the blue ink signatures you carelessly pressed onto the paper, and I own every single brutal predatory clause hidden deep in the fine print of that legal contract. As of last month, Apex Financial Solutions no longer holds the deed of trust to this property. Apex Holdings does. I do. The room felt like a vacuum. The oxygen had been entirely sucked out, leaving nothing but the suffocating, crushing weight of absolute financial ruin. Aunt Yvonne was gripping her chest, swaying slightly on her feet, as she realized the generational wealth her parents had built was completely gone. The pristine colonial house they used to anchor their entire social status in the local community was legally possessed by the niece she had relentlessly bullied and mocked for decades. Monique was still sitting on the wet floor, shivering in her ruined silk dress, completely forgotten by the parents who had just bankrupted themselves to buy her a fake life. You do not owe money to a faceless corporate bank anymore, Dad, I stated firmly, driving the final nail into his coffin. You owe over $500,000 directly to me, the exact same daughter you just violently disowned and tried to physically throw out into the freezing snow. Calvin sat paralyzed in his chair, his jaw trembling uncontrollably. He had spent his entire life dominating this family, using fear, intimidation, and financial control. He had stood in this very room 10 minutes ago and tried to extort me, using the church and the community. He had threatened to destroy my corporate reputation if I did not co-sign a new loan for his favorite daughter. He thought he held all the cards because he thought I was just a rich girl who was secretly desperate for her father's approval. He completely failed to realize that he was trying to aggressively blackmail the exact same person who held the literal legal deed to his entire existence. He had played a high-stakes game of financial chicken with a private equity CEO, and he had completely crashed his life into a brick wall. The utter silence in the dining room was broken only by the sound of Brenda quietly sobbing near the hallway archway. Her hands were shaking violently as she stood there entirely helpless, watching her husband's tyrannical reign completely disintegrate. I slowly turned my head away from the broken patriarch slumping in his chair. I shifted my cold, calm gaze across the room, bypassing my ruined sister on the floor and my horrified extended family. I looked directly at my mother, Specifically, I focused my eyes completely on the small, beautiful object she was still clutching nervously in her trembling hands. The soft red velvet gift box I had handed to her on the freezing porch now felt like a ticking time bomb resting in my mother's hands. Brenda was clutching it so tightly against her chest that her knuckles were completely white. She was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated terror, as if the small square box was suddenly going to burst into flames and burn her alive right there in the hallway. "Do you remember what Dad said to me when I first walked up to the front door tonight?" I asked, my voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence of the dining room. "He told me to leave my gift on the porch and go home. He said I was ruining the positive energy of the evening. He was so incredibly eager to banish me into the freezing snow that he did not even want to see what I had brought for him." I took another slow step toward Brenda, keeping my eyes locked firmly on hers. "Open the box, Mom." I commanded, my voice echoing softly, but carrying the absolute weight of a corporate mandate. "Open the beautiful Christmas present I brought for my loving family." Brenda shook her head frantically, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running down her pale cheeks. "No, Sasha, please," she whispered, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "Please do not do this to us. We are your parents. We are your family. We can fix this. We can sit down and talk about this like rational adults." "There is absolutely nothing left to talk about," I replied, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "The time for talking expired 6 months ago when Calvin stopped making his mortgage payments. The time for talking ended when you both decided to protect Monique's fragile ego instead of treating me like a human being. Open the box, Brenda. That is not a request." Brenda looked over at Calvin, desperately searching for her husband to step up and save her from this nightmare. But Calvin was completely paralyzed in his heavy oak chair, staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor like a defeated prisoner of war. He had absolutely no power left to wield. He could not scream or threaten or intimidate his way out of this trap. His tyrannical reign over this family had been completely dismantled piece by piece, and he was completely powerless to stop it. Realizing that nobody was going to come to her rescue, Brenda slowly lowered the red velvet box from her chest. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely grip the edges of the lid. The entire room watched in breathless anticipation. Aunt Yvonne leaned forward, her eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Uncle Terence held his breath, completely captivated by the brutal consequences of his brother's arrogant stupidity. Even Monique stopped her pathetic sniffling on the floor, looking up at the small red box with a look of terrified confusion. Brenda fumbled with the elegant gold ribbon tied around the velvet box. It took her several agonizing seconds to finally pull the knot loose. The ribbon fell away, sliding silently onto the floor. She took a deep, shaky breath and slowly lifted the lid off the box. She looked inside, and her entire body went completely rigid. She did not find a pair of diamond earrings or a luxury watch. She did not find a sentimental family photo or a heartfelt Christmas card offering my unconditional financial support. She did not find any of the typical superficial gifts this family usually exchanged to mask their deep emotional rot. "What is it?" Calvin croaked, his voice barely above a raspy whisper. "What is inside the box, Brenda?" Brenda could not speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She reached a trembling hand inside the red velvet lining and slowly pulled out a heavy set of brand new shiny brass keys. The keys clinked loudly against each other as they dangled from her shaking fingers. The sharp metallic sound echoed through the silent dining room, sounding exactly like the heavy slam of a prison cell door locking shut. Calvin stared at the brass keys, his pale face contorting in sheer confusion. "What are those?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why are there keys in the box?" "Those are the master keys to the new high-security deadbolts I had installed on the front and back doors of this property yesterday afternoon." I explained, my voice perfectly steady and cold. "While you were all out running last-minute holiday errands, I had a professional locksmith come to the house. I figured since I am the new legal owner of the property, I should probably have a secure set of keys to protect my massive financial investment. Aunt Yvonne let out a sharp, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both of her hands. Uncle Terence closed his eyes and slowly shook his head side to side, fully realizing the brutal, calculated irony of the entire situation. Calvin had literally tried to lock me out of my own house. He had stood on the front porch, blocking the doorway like an arrogant king, entirely unaware that the daughter he was banishing was holding the literal keys to his kingdom in a small red velvet box. But the keys are not the most important part of your Christmas gift. I continued, my gaze shifting back to the open box in my mother's trembling hands. Take out the rest of it, Mom. Show everyone what else I brought for you tonight. Brenda reached her shaking hand back into the box and pulled out a thick, heavy legal envelope. It was made of premium cream-colored parchment paper, sealed tightly with the thick metallic crest of the State of Illinois Corporate Property Division. The envelope looked incredibly heavy and official, radiating a sense of absolute terrifying finality. It was the kind of legal document that completely alters the trajectory of a person's life the moment it is opened. Read the bold lettering printed on the front of the envelope. I instructed her, watching the absolute horror completely consume her face. Read it out loud so Dad and Monique can hear exactly what kind of financial blessing I brought for the family this year. Brenda stared down at the thick legal envelope, her eyes rapidly scanning the black ink printed across the front. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. She read the words over and over again as if her brain was violently rejecting the information. The brutal reality of what those words meant, the absolute destruction of her social status, her comfort, and her future, crashed down onto her shoulders with the weight of a collapsing building. Her fingers completely lost their grip. The heavy envelope slipped from her hands and dropped onto the dining table, landing directly in the puddle of spilled cold water with a loud, wet smack. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost standing in the middle of a ruined holiday dinner. I reached across the dining table and calmly picked up the thick parchment envelope before the spilled ice water could soak all the way through the paper. My movements were slow and deliberate, completely unbothered by the collective panic radiating from every single person in the room. I pulled the heavy legal document from inside the envelope and unfolded it. The crisp sound of the thick paper snapping open was the only noise in the house. I held the document up so the warm light from the crystal chandelier illuminated the bold black text printed across the top of the page. I did not shout, and I did not need to scream to make them hear me. I simply projected my voice with the clear, practiced authority of a chief executive officer delivering a final corporate verdict. This is a final notice of foreclosure and execution of deed in lieu. I read aloud, making sure to enunciate every single devastating legal term. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. There was no ambiguity in what I was saying. There was no room for interpretation or emotional manipulation. This was the cold, hard, terrifying reality of American property law dropping squarely onto the center of their dining room table. Calvin tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He just stared at the piece of paper in my hand, his eyes wide and bloodshot. When you default on a subprime mortgage for 6 consecutive months, Dad, there are severe legal consequences, I explained, looking directly at him. You ignored all the warning letters. You threw away the certified mail from the collection agencies because you thought you could just hide from your massive financial mistakes. You thought the bank would just forget about $500,000. But you cannot hide from corporate debt. The contract you signed with Apex Financial Solutions contained a very specific, aggressive clause regarding severe default. It gave the lender the absolute legal right to execute a deed in lieu of foreclosure if the account became more than 180 days past due. Uncle Terence leaned heavily against the hallway archway, his face buried in his large hands. He worked in municipal administration, so he knew exactly what that meant. He knew that Calvin had unknowingly signed away every single protective legal right he possessed the very moment he took that predatory loan. Calvin had waived his right to a lengthy court battle to save the house all so Monique could drive a luxury car. When Apex Holdings acquired your toxic debt portfolio last month, my legal team immediately audited your specific file. I continued, my voice steady and completely relentless. We saw the 6 months of consecutive missed payments. We saw the massive ballooning interest rate that you could not possibly afford on a fixed retirement income. So we did exactly what any ruthless private equity firm would do to protect its massive financial assets. We triggered the default clause. We bypassed the lengthy traditional court foreclosure process entirely because you legally gave us the written permission to do so when you blindly signed that contract 14 months ago. Brenda let out a loud, agonizing wail, wrapping her arms around her own stomach as if she had just been physically gutted by an invisible blade. The ancestral home, the beautiful brick colonial house with the manicured lawn and the heated swimming pool, the pristine fortress of social superiority she had used to look down on the rest of the neighborhood for decades, was officially gone. Her entire identity was tied exclusively to this property, and she had just watched it evaporate into thin air right in front of her extended family. I lowered the legal document slightly, keeping my eyes locked on the broken man sitting at the head of the table. "There are no legal loopholes here, Calvin," I said, stripping away any tiny sliver of false hope he might still be clinging to. "There is no grace period left to negotiate. There is no local judge you can cry to, and there is no church pastor who can pray this massive corporate debt away. American commercial law does not care about your precious neighborhood reputation. It does not care that you wanted to look like a generous, wealthy patriarch. It does not care that Monique needed a brand new Porsche and a trip to Paris to feel good about herself on social media. The law only cares about the binding legal signature you put on the bottom line." Monique was still sitting on the wet floor, but she had completely stopped throwing her violent tantrum. She was staring up at me with a look of absolute sheer terror. The arrogant sister who had just mocked me, the woman who had demanded $50,000 to pay off her shopping addiction, was suddenly realizing that she was currently sitting on a hardwood floor that belonged entirely to me. The house she treated as her own personal kingdom was now my legal property. I raised my chin, standing tall and proud, in the very same room where I had been belittled and emotionally abused for my entire life. I had spent years trying to earn a seat at this table, but tonight I was taking the whole house. The county clerk's office fully processed and recorded the transfer of the title yesterday morning. I announced delivering the ultimate final blow to their shattered reality. The heavy brass keys inside that red velvet box are not a sick joke. They are a formal legal declaration of ownership. As of 9 a.m. yesterday morning, I am the sole legal owner of this entire property. The sheer absolute finality of the statement struck Calvin like a physical blow to his chest. His mind desperately tried to process the horrifying fact that the daughter he had just violently disowned, the daughter he had screamed at to get off his property, was actually the legal landlord of the ground he was currently standing on. He had threatened to burn the house down to keep me from getting a single dime, completely unaware that the house was already mine. The immense, suffocating weight of his own profound arrogance, his massive financial ignorance, and his catastrophic failures finally broke him completely in half. His tyrannical ego simply could not sustain the massive psychological damage of being so thoroughly conquered by the child he hated most. He tried to stand up from the heavy oak dining chair, perhaps to argue, or to physically take the document from my hands, but his body completely refused to cooperate. The strength drained entirely from his thick legs. His knees violently buckled beneath him, giving out completely under the crushing psychological weight of his absolute ruin. He stumbled backward away from the dining table, his arms flailing weakly in the air, trying to grab onto something solid. But there was nothing left to hold on to. He collapsed heavily backward, falling out of the dining room and crashing onto the living room sofa, his head falling back against the leather cushions. I watched my father gasping for air, his chest heaving violently under his burgundy sweater. His entire world had just collapsed around him. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him as he struggled to catch his breath in a house he no longer owned. I slowly turned my attention back to the dining table, where my mother was still staring blankly at the ruined legal document resting in the puddle of ice water. I pointed a steady finger at the thick, cream-colored paper. "Pick it up, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of Calvin's heavy breathing and the ticking grandfather clock. "Pick it up and look at the second page." Brenda reached out her trembling fingers brushing against the damp paper. She peeled the second page back, her hands shaking so badly that the heavy parchment rattled against the wood. Her eyes darted frantically across the text, but she was entirely too panicked to comprehend any of the legal jargon printed on the page. She just looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, completely broken and lost. "I will save you the trouble of translating the legalese," I announced, stepping closer to the archway so both my parents could hear me perfectly. When Calvin stood in the doorway an hour ago, he looked me up and down and told me to get out of his house. He said he would rather burn it to the ground than let me step foot inside. Well, that was a very bold statement for a man who has absolutely no legal right to even be standing on this hardwood floor. Calvin slowly turned his head to look at me from the sofa, his eyes bloodshot and wide with fear. "That piece of paper on the table is not just a notice of property transfer." I explained, my words dripping with absolute cold finality. "According to Illinois state commercial property law, that specific document serves as a formal binding eviction notice." Aunt Yvonne let out another suffocated gasp, clutching Uncle Terrence's arm so tightly her fingernails dug into his suit jacket. Brenda dropped the damp paper back onto the table as if it had suddenly burned her fingers. "Since the property was seized through commercial default, and the primary residents are not the legal leaseholders, you do not get the standard 30-day grace period," I stated, staring directly at my father. "You have exactly 7 days. You have one single week to pack up all your garbage, all your fake luxury clothes, and all your precious arrogant pride, and get the hell out of my house." The reality of the deadline struck them like a physical blow. 7 days to pack up 30 years of memories. 7 days to empty out the massive colonial home they had used to anchor their entire social identity. They were going to have to find cardboard boxes and load moving trucks right in front of all the wealthy neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress. For decades, this house was your ultimate weapon against me, I told them, my voice echoing through the silent rooms. You used the shelter of this roof to demand my absolute obedience. You used my childhood bedroom as a prison to punish me whenever I dared to dream bigger than you wanted me to. You thought the thick brick walls of this house protected you from the real world, but you traded this sanctuary away to buy Monique a sports car. You sold your entire kingdom for a handful of designer bags and a fake vacation, and now the bank has come to collect. I slowly turned my head and looked down at Monique. She was still sprawled on the wet floor, her expensive emerald green dress soaked in spilled wine and cold water. She looked up at me, her makeup completely running down her face, her false eyelashes hanging off the corners of her eyes. The smug, entitled golden child was completely gone, replaced by a terrified homeless woman who had just alienated the only rich man willing to tolerate her. "You wanted $50,000 tonight, Monique," I asked her, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sisterly warmth. "You wanted me to pay off your credit card so you could keep pretending to be a successful business owner? Well, now you need to use whatever available credit you have left to find a cheap apartment and rent a moving van. Because if you or our parents are still inside this property by next Friday morning, I will call the local sheriff's department. I will have all of you physically trespassed and forcibly removed from my property in handcuffs right in front of the entire neighborhood." Monique stared at me for a split second, her brain desperately trying to find a way out of the trap she had built for herself. But there was no way out. The total reality of her new homeless, broke existence finally shattered her mind entirely. She broke down into a loud, hysterical wailing, throwing her head back and screaming at the ceiling. The sound of her raw, primal sobbing filled the entire house, echoing terribly off the high ceilings. While Aunt Yvonne, Uncle Terrence, and the rest of the relatives sat frozen in their heavy oak chairs, completely paralyzed by a stunned, terrified silence. I stood there for a long moment, simply watching the absolute destruction of the people who had spent my entire life trying to destroy me. The dining room that had once been a courtroom for my daily convictions was now a graveyard for their massive egos. Monique continued to wail on the wet hardwood floor, her fingers desperately gripping the soaked edges of her ruined silk dress. Brenda was slumped against the archway, burying her face in her hands, as her entire false reality crumbled into dust. From the living room, the heavy, ragged sound of Calvin trying to catch his breath on the sofa was the only testament to the tyrannical patriarch who used to rule this house with an iron fist. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the familiar urge to drop to my knees and apologize for upsetting them. For the very first time in my 34 years of life, looking at my broken family did not fill me with a deep, agonizing sense of unworthiness. It filled me with absolute, profound peace. Without saying another word, I slowly reached down and grabbed the edges of my tailored wool coat. I pulled it tightly around my body and began to fasten the dark buttons one by one. My movements were completely casual and unhurried. I was not running away from a fight. I had already won the war. The family members who were still capable of conscious thought watched me in complete, terrified silence. Uncle Terence and Aunt Yvonne did not dare to speak or intervene. They knew that any sudden movement or misplaced word could easily turn my corporate wrath directly onto them. They remained firmly glued to their heavy oak chairs, shrinking back into the shadows of the dining room, hoping I would simply forget they were even there. I finished buttoning my coat and picked up my leather gloves from the entryway console table. I turned my back on the dining room and began to walk down the brightly lit hallway. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, leaving the chaotic sounds of sobbing and gasping behind me. When I reached the front entryway, I realized that the front door was still slightly ajar. Connor had not completely walked away into the winter night. He was standing out on the covered porch, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive winter coat. He had waited. He had stood out in the freezing cold to witness the final collapse of the toxic dynasty that had almost trapped him forever. As I approached the threshold, Connor pulled his hands out of his pockets and reached for the heavy brass doorknob. He pulled the thick wooden door open wider, stepping aside to clear my path. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The look in his eyes communicated absolute pure respect. He was looking at the woman who had just single-handedly dismantled a multi-generational cycle of psychological abuse, using nothing but cold, hard financial literacy and unbreakable boundaries. I gave him a single curt nod of acknowledgement and stepped past him, walking out onto the snowy porch. The freezing Chicago winter wind immediately washed over my face, but it did not feel bitter or biting anymore. It felt incredibly crisp and deeply refreshing. It felt like breathing pure, clean oxygen after being trapped in a suffocating, smoke-filled room for 20 years. The snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the manicured lawn and the icy driveway in a thick layer of pristine white. Parked at the very end of the long driveway, idling quietly in the falling snow, was a sleek black luxury SUV. My private driver stood patiently by the rear passenger door, holding a large black umbrella to shield the interior from the winter weather. I walked slowly down the concrete steps and made my way down the driveway. With every single step I took away from that brick colonial house, the remaining heavy chains of my traumatic childhood simply dissolved into the freezing air. Society spends so much time conditioning us to believe that blood is thicker than water. We are constantly told that we must forgive and endure endless amounts of toxic abuse simply because we share genetics with our abusers. We are shamed by the church, by our communities, and by our own guilty consciences into staying at tables where we are constantly served nothing but disrespect and emotional manipulation. But as I walked toward my waiting car, I finally understood the absolute truth. Family is not determined by biology. Family is not a legal obligation or a shared last name. Family is an action. Family is mutual respect. Family is unconditional support, and family is making space for each other to grow. If the people who share your blood refuse to give you those basic human dignities, then they are not your family. They are just people you happened to know when you were a child. You do not owe your life to people who actively try to destroy your spirit. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to stop carrying the heavy financial and emotional burdens of people who refuse to carry their own weight. You are allowed to evict the abusers from your life and from your property. The driver opened the heavy door of the SUV as I approached. "Good evening, Ms. Washington," he said softly, giving me a polite professional nod. "Good evening," I replied, stepping into the warm, luxurious interior of the vehicle. The soft leather seats and the quiet hum of the engine wrapped around me like a protective shield. The driver closed the door with a solid, comforting thud, shutting out the howling winter wind and the distant, muffled sounds of my former family tearing themselves apart inside that dying house. I settled back into the plush leather seat and stared straight ahead through the tinted windshield. I did not turn my head to look back at the brightly lit windows of the colonial home. I did not look back at the snowy porch or the broken people I was leaving behind to face their own devastating consequences. I had spent my entire life looking backward, hoping for a sliver of validation that was never going to come. Tonight, I was finally looking forward. I did not need a seat at their miserable table anymore because I had built my own massive empire from the ground up, and I was the only one who held the keys. The driver put the car into gear, and the heavy black SUV pulled smoothly out of the driveway tires, crunching softly against the fresh snow. We drove away into the cold, quiet night, leaving the past exactly where it belonged behind me forever.